Vivid verses.
The drive out was easy. One of those early autumn evenings where the sky can't decide between orange and gray and settles on both. Cassie sat in the passenger seat with her knee bouncing, which she did when she was nervous, which she almost never was. That alone told me something. "They're going to love you," she said, for the third time since we'd left my place. I didn't say anything. I watched the road. She reached over and put her hand on mine where it rested on the gear shift. "I'm serious. My dad's a little. He could be a lot at first. But once he warms up—" "Cassie, what?" "Stop selling me on it." She pulled her hand back, not offended, just caught. She knew what I meant. Either it would go well or it wouldn't, and rehearsing scenarios in the car wasn't going to change which one materialized. She'd been with me long enough to know I didn't operate on nerves. She just hadn't fully stopped operating on them herself yet. The house was a two-story colonial at the end of a quiet street, the kind of house that announced a family had lived there a long time. Deep green shutters, a basketball hoop at the edge of the driveway with a net that had seen better days, a porch light already on even though the sun hadn't fully set. Someone had been watching for headlights. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for exactly one breath. Assess. Don't assume. Whatever happens in there, you respond to what's real, not what you've preloaded. That was the rule I'd built over years of situations that require composure I wasn't born with, how to construct deliberately, piece by piece, the way you waterproof a wall, layer by patient layer until nothing gets through you sideways anymore. "Ready?" Cassie asked. "Yes," I said, and I was. Her mother, Lorraine, opened the door before we reached the porch steps. She was a small woman with Cassie's cheekbones and an expression I cataloged immediately. Warm surface, watchful underneath. She hugged Cassie first, then turned to me with both hands extended and took mine in hers the way people do when they want to look at you while pretending they're greeting you. "We've heard so much," she said. "Hopefully the useful parts," I said, and she laughed. Not the polite version, the real one, just briefly like it surprised her. I filed that away. She had a sense of humor she didn't deploy immediately with strangers, which meant she was more guarded than her warmth suggested. Inside, the house smelled like roasted garlic and something sweet in the oven. The kind of smell that takes hours to build and means someone had been cooking since midday. That meant this dinner mattered to them, whatever their posture would be. Cassie's brother, Theo, was already in the living room, 20-something, stretched out on the couch with the ease of someone who lived there at least partially. He had the remote in one hand and a soda can balanced on his chest. He sat up when we came in, more alert than he'd been pretending. "Hey," he said to me, with that calibrated neutrality young men deploy when they're trying to reserve judgment without showing they're reserving it. "Hey," I said back, same register. Her sister, Bree, was at the kitchen table working on something on her laptop. Early 20s, I guessed. She gave me a look that lasted about half a second longer than casual, the kind of look that is actually measurement, then smiled and said hi. Bree was the one who'd done the asking around. Not a certainty, just a read. Something in the precision of her look. She knew specifics. She was deciding whether to surface. "No, watch Bree." The father hadn't appeared yet. Lorraine handed me a glass of water without asking if I wanted one, which was either hospitality or a way of giving herself something to do. I thanked her and held it. "Garrett will be down in a minute," she said, meaning the father. He was on the phone. Cassie had gone to drop her jacket somewhere. I stood in the kitchen doorway, not awkward, just present. Theo had drifted in behind me. Bree closed her laptop. "Cassie says you're into photography," Bree said. "On weekends, sometimes." "What do you shoot?" "Mostly landscapes. Architecture when I can find something worth the frame." She nodded, and I could see her revising something. She'd expected a different kind of answer. Maybe something more impressive, more polished. What I'd given her was true and unembellished, and that apparently read as either honesty or indifference to impressing her, and she wasn't sure which. Both, I thought. It's both. A door opened somewhere above us. Footsteps on stairs. The kind of footsteps that have weight to them. Not heavy, but deliberate, the way a person walks when they're not in a hurry and don't need to be. Garrett came into the kitchen, and I understood immediately why the room had a slightly different temperature with him in it. He was in his early 60s, I guessed, solidly built with gray at his temples and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had traded some of that in for something harder and more useful. He wore a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he moved like a man who had spent a lot of years being the one people looked at when they needed someone to make a decision. He looked at me. Not a greeting, a look. The preliminary kind, where the decision hasn't been made yet, but the process has already started. Then he extended his hand, and I shook it. Firm. He held it a half-second longer than necessary. Testing grip, or maybe just holding the introduction long enough to read something in it. Garrett, he said. Good to meet you, I said. He released my hand and turned toward the stove to say something to Lorraine, and I thought, he's already done the reading. Whatever he found, he's sitting on it. The dinner table is where he'll use it. Dinner was set on a rectangular table that could fit 6 without crowding. Lorraine had put effort into it. Cloth napkins, a candle in the center that was slightly too formal for the rest of the room, but indicated she'd wanted this to feel significant. Cassie sat across from me, with Bree to her left and Theo to Cassie's right. Garrett sat at the head. Lorraine brought things out in stages and then sat at the far end. The food was genuinely good. Roast chicken, roasted root vegetables, something green and garlicky that I ate 2 helpings of. I made a point of saying so to Lorraine, and I meant it. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was navigable. Theo was doing something in logistics that he described with more enthusiasm than clarity. Bree was finishing a degree. Cassie was catching everyone up on a renovation she'd been managing. I asked questions when there was space for them and answered what I was asked without over-explaining. I could feel Garrett listening even when he wasn't looking at me. He participated in the conversation enough not to be conspicuous, but not enough to be relaxed. He was waiting for something or building to something, and I'd known it since the stairs. Don't get ahead of it. Don't start defending yourself against something that hasn't happened. That was the trap, anticipating an attack and preloading a defense that makes you look defensive before a word has been fired. I'd seen men step into that trap a dozen times. The anxiety of waiting for something to land makes you act like it already has. So I ate. I asked Theo a follow-up question about the logistics thing that was specific enough that he looked slightly surprised. I complimented Bree on something she'd said about her coursework that I actually found interesting. I was present, fully. Cassie caught my eye once across the table, and something in her expression had softened from the nerves she'd had in the car. I think she'd expected me to be performing by now, the effortful version of yourself you put on for parents. I wasn't performing. I was just there. The candle had burned down a little when it happened. Garrett set his knife against the side of his plate with a small, deliberate sound. He looked at me the way a man looks when he's already decided and is just finding the opening. I want to be straight with you, he said. The table went quiet in the specific way of people who knew what was coming and had been dreading this moment for different reasons. Lorraine's hand moved slightly toward her glass and stopped. Bree looked at the table. Theo made a small adjustment in his chair that was really just the body's way of signaling, don't involve me in this. Cassie said nothing. I set my fork down. Not dramatically. Just set it down the way you do when someone is speaking, and it would be rude to keep eating. I wiped my mouth with the cloth napkin and put it back in my lap. I looked at Garrett and waited. We've looked into you, he said. Cassie's family. That's what we do when something matters to us. A brief pause. We don't think you're right for our daughter. Lorraine nodded once. not vigorously. The nod of someone who had agreed to the statement before tonight, but was less certain of it now in the room with the actual person in question. Nobody else moved. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Long enough for the words to sit. Long enough for a lesser version of me. The version that existed before I'd learned what composure actually required. To flush with heat and say something he'd regret. I felt none of that. What I felt was something closer to clarity. The kind that comes when a thing you'd prepared for quietly, without naming it, finally materializes and you realize the preparation was enough. He said his piece. He means it. It isn't a negotiation opener, it's a verdict. The question is who the verdict is actually aimed at. I looked at Garrett evenly. I respect that it's your opinion, I said. It isn't the one that governs my life. If your daughter chooses to continue with me, we'll carry on. If not, I'll get over it. I picked up my fork. I ate. No heat in my voice. No coldness either. Both of those would have been performances. Both would have cost me something. What I'd said was exactly what I meant, framed exactly the way I want it framed, and then I'd return to dinner because there was nothing else to say. The table sat in silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. Garrett looked at me. I looked at my plate, then back up at him when I felt his gaze still there. He had the expression of a man who had thrown a rock into water and was watching the ripples, or rather, watching the absence of them. Lorraine reached for her wine glass and took a slow sip. Theo cleared his throat and said, to no one in particular, "The chicken really is good, Mom." Bree made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and reached for her water. Cassie still hadn't spoken. I could feel her looking at me from across the table, but I didn't look back yet. I wasn't performing for her either. Garrett picked up his fork. The conversation didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't. There was no pretending that it had been a minor moment. But it resumed. Lorraine asked Bree something about a classmate. Theo picked up the logistics thread again with a slightly different energy, the way a person talks when they're genuinely trying to fill space. I responded to what was addressed to me, asked a question that wasn't aggressive and wasn't sycophantic. I finished my meal. Dessert was something with apples and a crumble topping that Lorraine brought out with the careful manner of someone who had baked it that morning as an act of hope. I had a full portion and said it was excellent, and it was. Garrett spoke twice during dessert, once to Theo about something practical, once to Lorraine about whether there was more coffee. He didn't address me again directly, but I caught him watching me twice with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not softened exactly, more like recalibrating. You expected a reaction, I thought, not unkindly. You didn't get the one you prepared for. That's not my problem. I'd seen this before, not this specific scenario, but the underlying architecture of it. The testing authority figure who expects either submission or explosion, because those are the two outcomes that confirm their worldview. Submission says, "You're right. I need your approval." Explosion says, "You were right to doubt him." What I'd given him was neither, and that was the thing he was currently sitting with. He wasn't a bad man. I didn't think that. He was a man who loved his daughter and had decided to love her in a protective way that had probably served her at 16 and was now a habit applied at 30. And he'd miscalculated that the person across his dinner table would fall neatly into one of two reactions. The fact that I hadn't didn't make me his enemy. It just made him uncertain, and uncertainty in a man like Garrett would either calcify or become something more interesting over time. That wasn't tonight's problem. We helped clear the table, or rather, Cassie and I did, because that's what you do, and I wasn't going to leave it all for Lorraine after she'd cooked for 3 hours. Bree joined in after a moment. Theo disappeared somewhere, which was probably his default. Standing at the kitchen sink while Lorraine packaged up leftovers, Cassie stood close to me and said, very quietly, near my ear, "Are you okay?" I looked at her. "I'm fine." She studied my face like she was looking for the fine print. That was, he really said, He said what he thought. I said, still quiet. That's not nothing. Most people don't. She looked at me for a long moment. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, which was unusual. Cassie was readable to me in most contexts. Whatever was moving across her face right now was something more complicated than what she usually lets surface, a reassessment, maybe, or the beginning of one. Lorraine set a container of leftovers on the counter and said, "To the room generally. There's plenty if you want to take some." "Thank you," I said. "That will be great." She smiled, and this time it reached further than the first one at the door. Something had shifted for her across the course of the evening, though she wasn't the type to announce it. We said our goodbyes in the entryway. Theo appeared again and gave me a nod that had a different quality than the one at the start of the evening. Still reserved, but without the deliberate blankness. Bree hugged Cassie and then looked at me and said, "It was good to meet you," and she meant it more than the polite form of the sentence usually carries. Garrett stood at the edge of the entryway with his arms crossed. Not hostile, just present. I turned toward him before heading to the door. "Thank you for the meal," I said. "It was a good dinner." He looked at me. Something worked behind his eyes. "Drive safe," he said. I nodded once and followed Cassie out. The porch light was still on. The night had gone fully dark while we were inside, and the air had that sharp quality autumn gets after sunset when it stops pretending to be summer. I could hear crickets somewhere in the hedgerow. Cassie walked beside me to the car, but didn't get in immediately. She stood on the passenger side with her hand on the door handle and looked across the roof at me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. I waited. "Stay. Finish the meal. Thank him." She paused. "Most people would have." "I know what most people would have done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The porch light caught the side of her face. "How do you do that?" she asked. Not rhetorical, an actual question. "Do what?" "That." She gestured, a small movement that was trying to encompass what she'd witnessed. "Sit there and let him say that and just not react. Not defend yourself or get up or argue." I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because defending yourself against someone's opinion is like arguing with the weather, I said. You could be right and still get wet. And arguing across someone's dinner table when they've invited you and doesn't prove anything except that you care more about winning the argument than about the person it's supposedly about. She looked at me steadily. "He was wrong," she said. "Probably. But that's not why I stayed quiet." "Then why?" "Because it wasn't my table," I said. His house, his opinion, his family watching. Getting heated in that room would have made it about me and him. I didn't want it to be about that. "What did you want it to be about?" I held her gaze. "You." Eventually. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind that has weight to it, that is holding several things at once. The porch light hummed faintly. Somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something it probably couldn't see. She opened the car door and got in. I got in and started the engine. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He wasn't wrong about everything." I glanced at her. "He's protective," she said. "He's always been. It's not always right, but it comes from something real." She paused. "The last person I brought home, he didn't say anything at dinner. He was perfectly pleasant all evening, shook my dad's hand, told my mom a meal was delicious." She looked out the window, and then 6 months later he was gone, and it turned out my dad had seen something I hadn't. Something in the pleasantness. I didn't respond. I waited for her to find what she was actually saying. "That's why he does it," she said. "The dinner. The looking into people. He got burned once watching me get burned, and he decided he wasn't going to stay quiet about what he saw anymore." She turned to look at me, which I don't always love, but I understand it. "He's still wrong," I said. Not defensively, just as a statement of fact. "I know," she said. And then, smaller, "I think he might figure that out." I pulled out of the driveway and onto the quiet street. The headlights cut through the dark ahead of us. We were 20 minutes from her apartment when she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." When he said that, at the table, she turned slightly in her seat. "What went through your mind?" Actually, I thought about being evasive. I wasn't the type to narrate my internal architecture freely. But she was asking something real, and she'd been honest with me in the car, and that deserved something in kind. "I noticed he'd been building to it," I said, "from the time he came down the stairs. The way he was listening without looking. The way he positioned himself at the table. He had something to say, and dinner was his format. And that didn't," she stopped, "scare me?" "No." I was going to say upset you. "No." I thought about how to be precise. Anger is usually about expectation. You get angry when something happens that shouldn't. But I never assumed that dinner was going to be a straightforward, pleasant evening. I assumed it was an assessment. And assessments sometimes go against you. She was quiet. "The thing I was most focused on," I continued, "was not making whatever he said about me. That's the trap. Someone says something you disagree with, and you get defensive, and now the whole room is looking at you to see how you handle friction. I didn't want to be handled. You wanted to handle yourself." "Yes." She looked out at the passing dark. "Where did you learn to be like that?" she asked. I thought about it. There wasn't one source. There wasn't a single moment or person or lesson. It was more like a long accumulation of having been the other version, the reactive version, the version that said the sharp thing in the sharp moment and watched what it cost him over and over until the cost got clear enough that a different approach became less of a discipline and more of a preference. "Expensive mistakes," I said. She made a soft sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He rattled me once." I told her. "Not tonight. A long time ago. Someone like your father, different context, same energy. Said something in front of people that was designed to reduce me, and I let him. I went cold, then hot, and I said something I regret saying because it was true, but it was cruel, and it didn't need to be said the way I said it." I paused. Afterward, I wasn't ashamed of what I'd said. I was ashamed of why I'd said it. Because it was self-defense. It was about me, not about the actual situation. She was looking at me. "So I worked on it," I said. "Not being unfeeling. That's different. Being able to feel something clearly without it running the show." She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "He's going to feel stupid eventually." "My dad." "Maybe," I said. "Not because of what he said, but because of you." She seemed to be arranging words carefully. "Because he walked into that dinner with a conclusion already written, and you just sat there and ate and thanked him for the food, and at no point did any of it match what he decided." I said nothing. "That's its own kind of thing," she said. "What kind?" "Confidence without need. That's not common." She paused. "The confidence I usually see needs something from the room. Needs you to see it. Yours doesn't." I thought about that. She wasn't wrong, but I wasn't sure it was a virtue exactly so much as an arrangement I'd arrived at after years of learning that needing things from rooms was expensive and unreliable. "It's less virtuous than it looks," I said. "Maybe," she said, but it was still something to see. I parked outside her building and walked her to the door. The street was quiet. The kind of late evening quiet that feels specific to a weeknight. Not the dead quiet of past midnight, but the settled quiet of ordinary life going to bed. At the door, she turned and looked at me with something she hadn't had in her face in the car on the way there. "What he said," she started. "Cassie." "No, let me." She took a breath. "What he said is, it doesn't come from nowhere. He has a process. He called someone. He asked around. He built a case, and he brought it to the dinner table, and he said it plainly and in front of everyone." She paused, and I just sat there. There it was. She'd been sitting with this for the last half hour, maybe longer, maybe since the moment at the table when she hadn't spoken. I'd noticed. I'd filed it. I hadn't pushed on it because that wasn't the car ride for it. "I didn't say anything," she said. "He said that to you?" And I sat there. I looked at her. "It's your family," I said. That's not. It's not an excuse, I said. I know, but it's true. And that table isn't a simple space. You've been eating at it your whole life. The way the power runs in a family is its own terrain, and it takes time to know when you're ready to push back and in what direction. I paused. I'm not angry with you. You should be a little, she said quietly. I'm not. Why? Because anger requires expectation, I thought. And I didn't expect you to defend me in that room. I hoped you might, in a future version of that dinner, in a different form. But I didn't go in there expecting rescue, and the absence of what I didn't expect isn't a wound. What I said out loud was, because I handled it, and because what I need from you isn't defense. It's knowing where you stand. She looked at me steadily. Where I stand? Yes. She thought about that. I think he's wrong, she said. Completely. And I think the longer he knows you, the more wrong he's going to be by his own measurement. Whatever he found when he looked into you, he found the version that could be categorized. He hasn't found, she stopped. Say it. He hasn't found what tonight was, she said. That calm. That way of being in a room when someone's trying to rattle you. She shook her head slightly. I've been with you long enough to think I knew what that looked like. But seeing it under that kind of pressure, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Get inside, I said, not unkindly. It's cold. She smiled, briefly and with something in it that wasn't quite the smile I'd learned. Deeper than the usual one. More considered. Thank you for tonight, she said. Your mother's cooking was worth it. She laughed. The real one, the loose one she kept back when things felt precarious and let out when they didn't anymore. She pressed her key into the lock and opened the door and looked back at me once before she went in. The expression on her face was one I hadn't seen before, not in this form. It was something in the nature of recalibration, of a woman who had thought she understood the dimensions of a thing and had just discovered one she hadn't mapped yet, hadn't known to look for, and was now deciding what to do with that discovery. The door closed. I walked back to the car. The drive home was quiet. I didn't put music on. I let the dark come in through the windows and the headlights do their job ahead of me, and I thought about almost nothing, which was how I knew I was all right. What Garrett had said wasn't a wound. It wasn't even close. I've been clear about that at the table, and I was clear about it now. But I didn't dismiss it the way that dismissal can become its own fragility, the bravado of I don't care, it doesn't touch me. Because it had touched me, in the technical sense. I'd felt the words land. I'd registered the weight of them, the intentional gravity Garrett had given them, the way he designed the setting for maximum effect. I felt all of that. And then I'd set my fork down and wiped my mouth and said what was true. I respected his opinion. It would not govern my life. Cassie would choose, as she always could choose, as any person can, as that was the nature of being an adult with her own standing in the world. And whatever she chose, the world would continue. Her choice would be hers. My response to it would be mine. That was all. That was all there was to it. The house lights gave way to highway darkness. I settled into the drive and let my mind go quiet the way it does when the hard part of the day is over and the soft part hasn't started yet. I thought briefly about Garrett's face when I'd thanked him for the meal. The small adjustment in his expression. Not softening, I wasn't going to call it that, but something working underneath. The particular expression of a man who has been prepared for one kind of conversation and received another, and knows, somewhere in the working part of his mind, that he is going to have to do some revising. I didn't need him to revise. I didn't need his approval, just as I'd said. But I wasn't indifferent to it the way indifference can be its own posture. If he revised, that would be his work to do, in his time, for his reasons. It would have nothing to do with me performing for it. The exit came up. I took it. I thought about what Cassie had said on the sidewalk. He hasn't found what tonight was. She was right about that, in her way. Whatever had been found about me through phone calls and asking around and the research that careful, worried father's conduct, all of it was the record. The paper. The outline of a person as seen from the outside, assembled from what others could report. What you couldn't find in research was how someone sat at your table after you told them they weren't good enough. What you couldn't find was whether someone needed your table to feel like they were good enough. I didn't need Garrett's table. I didn't need his verdict reversed, though I was certain it would be. I needed nothing from that house except what I'd walked out with. The knowledge of who I was in a hard room, which was the same person I'd been driving over, which was the same person I would be when Cassie made her decision, whatever it was. The apartment came into view. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for exactly one breath, the way I had outside her family's house. Then I got out, locked the car, and went inside. 3 days later, Cassie called. Not a text. A call which she did when something was on her mind that she'd been turning over for a while. I answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Hey." Silence for a moment. That was her gathering herself. "I talked to him," she said. "My dad." I waited. I told him that what he said at dinner was his to say, but that I needed him to understand something. I could hear her choosing words carefully, the way she did when she'd rehearsed and then decided to go off script. I told him that I had sat at that table and let him say that and not said a word, and that I wasn't going to do that again. That the next time he had an opinion about someone I brought home, he could share it with me privately and I would hear it, but that I wasn't going to sit quiet while he delivered it as a verdict in front of everyone. I said nothing. He was quiet for a long time, she continued. And then he said he'd sat with what happened at dinner. The way you responded. A pause. He said he'd expected you to push back. "I know." He said when you didn't, he didn't know what to do with that. She paused. He said most men either fold or come out fighting. Most men haven't thought it through. She laughed softly. I said something like that to him. Actually, I waited again. He said he wants to have you over again, she said. Not right away, but that he thinks he may have. She stopped. He didn't say he was wrong. You know how dads are. I know how people are. He said he may have been incomplete. I thought about that. Incomplete. That was a word chosen carefully by a careful man. A word that preserved his standing while making room for new information. I respected that in its way. I told him the door was open, I said. She went quiet. You mean that? Yes. Even after. Cassie. I kept my voice steady and warm. He loves you. He went about it poorly. That's a recoverable situation. She breathed out slowly. You're not what I expected, she said. I know. I mean that as. I know how you mean it. A pause. Comfortable now, the kind of silence that sits between two people who have been through a thing together and come out on the same side of it. Dinner Thursday, she said. My place. Nothing complicated. I'll be there, I said. I'll cook. I'll bring wine. She was smiling when she hung up. I could tell from the sound of it. I set the phone down and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and then I went on with my day.
Thanks for listening.